Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast live stream. I'm Andy Lapata. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have joined us live, and as I regularly do now, I'm going to give you a time check just in case you think that we're live, but you're actually watching the replay. So it's now Friday, the 30th of July. It's meant to be summer. It's not today. And it's 3 p.m. exactly in the UK. So if you're joining us live, welcome. We are broadcasting live on LinkedIn, on Facebook and on YouTube. And if you want to join the conversation, you are welcome to just type in the comments on whichever platform you are watching on, and we'll bring you into the conversation as and when we can. If you haven't joined me before, here's what happens. I publish the Connected Leadership Podcast on all the normal podcast channels every Monday and every Thursday. The Monday episode is normally about 45 minutes, and I have an array of fascinating guests from all over the world, all different backgrounds. And the common linking theme is the importance of professional relationships for executive success. The most recent podcast, which was published this week on Monday, was with Sabra Horn, who has just stepped back from Director of Innovation at the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So that's the federal government cybersecurity defense, effectively, and is now in the private sector working on the same sector, the same topic. So fascinating interview. So on Monday on the podcast, Sabra talked all about terrorist threats and how things have changed, and how we've got to look at hacking in both a positive light as well as the more negative one we hear about, and understanding that a bit better, and the innovation across the US federal government agencies and how that's helping them to stay ahead of the game. And then on Thursdays, we publish a 15-minute, roughly, interview where we dig a little bit more deeper, looking at that guest's own career and the impact of professional relationships on their career, and how and the types of resources that have impacted them. So yesterday, if you're watching this live, Sabra was back on and talking about those things. And we record both in one go on the live stream. So my guest today will join me for two interviews, not one. So we'll be with you till probably just after 4 o'clock, give or take. My guest today is someone I've known for a number of years now. I did a lot of work with the company that he founded, Mallow Street, which was part of Redington, a very well-known investment consultancy in the pension sector. Did a lot of work with Mallow Street over the years. I've got to know Rob pretty well. Always impressed me, and I wasn't surprised when he went on to become the Director of Investments at the UK's, I think I'm right in saying, largest financial advice network, St James's Place. And I am a client, and St James's Place have been a client of mine as well. So it was great to see Rob join that organisation that I was already so closely tied into. Rob has made a real splash as Director of Investments there, and I've seen this week that they've announced their half-yearly results. And Rob is very heavily quoted in that. Excellent results. I saw a blog by our mutual friend Henry Tapper, who was really praising Rob and praising the team at SJP for the results that they've achieved and what they're doing in the investment space. So, Rob, on that good news and on that good note, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, good afternoon, Andy, and thank you for the kind introduction. And yeah, this amazingly is my first LinkedIn live. So I've done numerous podcasts, but I've never done a live one. So thank you.
Yeah, and I you said that on LinkedIn earlier this week, and given what I know about you, and we're going to come on to that, that surprised me. Because I would have thought you would have been all over this and have your own live stream channel already. So maybe that's something to look at for the next part of the year after you get back from your holidays. Because with your network and with your range of expertise and the way you approach work and business, you wouldn't be out of place doing something like this as well. But I guess that leads us on to our topic, because we had a chat a few weeks ago. When I started the podcast, I had my list of people I wanted on as guests, and you were in that initial list. You were one of the first people I approached. When we talked a few weeks ago about how we would approach the podcast, once we had it booked in, we came up with a theme, a topic that was slightly different to my original plan, and I really liked it. And that was, I've themed it as not judging books by their cover. And I think I've just demonstrated that in a sense, because I made an assumption. I would have assumed that you'd been all over LinkedIn Live because of what I know about you. It's slightly different, but it still shows the power of assumption. We are so quick to make assumptions about the people we know, and the people, whether they're in our network already or whether we're meeting them for the first time. It can be the way people dress, it can be the way they speak, it can be their age, it can be their job title, it can be their education, it can be based on who introduces us to them or how we met them as well. It's really easy to make assumptions about people, and I think what I know about you, I know that your life and your certainly your professional life is a lot richer than people might assume for someone with such a corporate role. So I guess that's where I want to start. And before I do, by the way, Andrew Bryant, a good friend of mine, has just cropped up on LinkedIn and said greetings from Portugal. Andrew, Rob's on his way to Portugal, hopefully for a holiday next week. And I was just saying how I really want to be out there for your birthday in September. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but that's another conversation. But Andrew's a self-leadership expert, so I think this will be right up his street as well. And Andrew, I look forward to you commenting as we go through. But Rob, let's get back to this point. First of all, do people tend to pigeonhole you based on your job title, the way you present yourself? And when they do, how does it make you feel?
Do they pigeonhole me, or context is everything? So I try and think about what are the different ways I appear in different people's lives. So you're right, I have a role as Director of Investments of SJP. I am known as the kind of co-founder of Redington and the co-founder of Mallow Street and Red Start. I wrote a children's book. But then at my daughter's school, I'm just Rob, father of two daughters. And, I was dropping them off at sports camp yesterday or picking them up. And yeah, I'm just father to these two girls. And it's interesting when you bump into people who maybe know you in one world and then maybe see you in another world, like on a Saturday morning when I'm swimming with the girls. And I think people get that bit right, and sometimes they get it wrong. And, it won't surprise you that I've sometimes had someone try and sell to me whilst I'm trying to sort of change my daughter after a swimming lesson, and you're on a Saturday morning and you're like, I'm not sure that's the right way to approach it. So I think that's the key thing to me, is that we all probably have many roles. For me, as a husband, a father, as someone who's got a lot of responsibility at work, and I suppose you hope that people approach you with the right awareness about what conversation are they having with you, and also when is it. If someone comes up to me on the platform at Waterloo as I'm commuting home, that's very different to someone coming up to me on a Saturday morning when I'm in Waitrose with my daughters. So, as I say, some people get it right, but a surprising number of people get those things wrong.
There's a couple of things I want to come back to a little bit later in our discussion there, particularly the people that just try and sell to you in any environment straight away, but also how you are in the different parts of your world. But I'd like to sort of go back a little bit more to the professional environment. So you mentioned that you've written a children's book, for example. I think straight away for you, that's normal. That's natural. You've written a children's book, and it's a very good one. I have a copy you gave to me after we met for a coffee a couple of years ago. In your world, in our world, that's not an unusual thing. In the world of investments generally, it probably does stand out from the crowd a little bit more. And I think it suggests there's a richness, a depth to your personality that a job title couldn't define. So do you find that people look at your job title and you're Oxford educated, you're very well spoken, you're very well presented, so you fit a lot of the expectations of the stereotype, if you like, when on first meeting someone from financial services industry? Do you think that people make assumptions about you that don't allow for that depth, and can you see that in the way that they engage with you?
Yeah, no, definitely. So as you say, sticking to the professional, I suppose at one end is just the just complete lack of awareness, which is, hey, I've got this fund, can I sell it to you? No, no context, no even research into what you're working in, no hook between something they've maybe heard me say on a podcast or say on LinkedIn. Just boom, let me just offload whatever I want to do onto you. I actually did a podcast probably 1 or 2 months ago, actually, for the Investment Association, and the lady interviewing me, she's a headhunter, and she made that assumption. She was trying to understand my background and my career and how did I get into finance. Uh, and in preparing for the podcast and in interviewing me, I suppose I uncovered my background. I was born in Holland. I lived in Argentina, and she'd assumed I'd had this sort of very privileged straight line journey into investment banking, as you say, for Oxford University, into investment banking, and then into finance, and assumed it had basically been an easy ride for me. And when I walked her through the choices I faced, the decisions I made, and how I'd overcome it, she realized that wasn't the case. So I think that is the danger: is it's easy to assume that someone is where they are because some some assumptions which just aren't true. And I think I'm often reminded myself of probably being guilty of making those same things. And I suppose it's really important to see the world through someone else's eyes and also think, how did they get there? And I suppose this is always my number one advice to people who are starting out in their careers. Luckily, we've got summer interns again. We've got apprentices. We're doing this brilliant scheme with 10,000 black interns. And my advice to them was be curious. Your job is to try and, I said, just wander up to anyone and offer to take them out for a coffee and ask them, why do they work here? How did they get into this job? Why do they do? What do they love about it? What do they learn? And just sort of try and be like Sherlock Holmes, just be super curious. Uh, and I think the truth is, so many professional interactions, people don't start from a level of curiosity. They start from a level of assumption, and they start from a position that I want to sell something to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. So let's be curious then. So I talked about your children's book, but that's not even scratching the surface, and possibly some people listening are thinking, what children's book, what's that about, how did that come about? So and you've touched on your journey, but briefly touched on it. So let me be curious, how did Rob Gardner end up where he is today, and where did you come from? What is that story?
Yeah, well, look, where did I come from? I was born in Holland. My mum and dad were both teachers, and in the late 70s they met and got married there, and I was born there. My sister was born there, and uh, that's interesting because as a small child, Holland, I think, has always been ahead of most countries when it comes to environmental issues. Holland, as you know, a lot of it's under below sea level and is more exposed to climate change and environmental changes than probably any other country in Europe. So as a small boy, I kind of had this sense, and I'll come back to that because that links to kind of my passion for uh, solving the environmental issues that we face today. But they basically, my mum and dad were teachers. They taught all over the world. We lived in Argentina. They taught in the Middle East. I went to boarding school in Bristol. Uh, the link with my children's book and living in Argentina was hyperinflation. So when we were living in Argentina after the 80s, not only did I get to witness England lose to Argentina in the World Cup in Argentina, which was an interesting experience, and just after Las Malvinas or the Falklands War, but inflation was running at over 30% a month. We used to, every month, my mum and dad would collect us up and we'd go out and we'd do all of our shopping. If we needed new shoes or new clothes, we'd get that. prices would change every day in the supermarket, and so the prices would change intraday on a loaf of bread, on a pint of milk, and that was normal. So 7, 8 years old, that was normal. Of course, that's completely abnormal. But from a very young age, I think my parents not deliberately sat me down, but just by sheer exposure, taught me the importance of earning money and keeping money, and specifically keeping money was against the ravages of inflation. And then it wasn't really until I started working in finance after I graduated from university, and specifically working with pensions, did I understand this idea of compound interest, this idea that you can invest your money in shares and benefit in their growth and success. And so when when my first daughter was born, I was looking for a new challenge. I knew people like you had written a book. We've got a common friend, Dan Priestley, had
Yeah.
written a book and always talks about the importance of writing a book. And I I was reading a lot of children's books, Peppa Pig and all the rest, and I thought actually this is a brilliant medium to speak to two audiences, actually, to the child and to the parent. And it was that inspired me to write Save Your Acorns, which is just a simple parable about effectively earning money, keeping money, and growing money, told through the story of some squirrels and some monkeys. Uh, and yeah, and look, it's the gift that keeps on giving. I wrote it 5 years ago. It's been translated into Spanish. It's been translated into Cantonese. I've got someone who's looking to translate it into German, and I must have gifted and sold well over 10,000 copies now, and that's great. And you know that actually you're having a small impact on people, and then I often, at least once a week, get a message of someone saying, "I read your book to my child or my grandchild. We've just opened up a pension for them, or just opened up a JISA." And yeah, that's probably the most amazing thing about that book, that it pays forward, right? You never, I never thought it would have this impact 5 years later, but it keeps on giving.
Oh, yeah. There's something wonderful about years after you've written a book, someone turning around and saying, "We've just read it; it's had this impact." And I know that when I read your book, my immediate reaction was, "I wish I'd seen that when I was a kid." Because it explains something so important in such simple and accessible terms that even I could understand it. So I'm sure the average kid could as well. Um, when I was doing a lot of networking training, I don't do so much now, but when I was training people how to work a room, for example, which actually was the first event I think I did with Mallow Street way back in the day, one of the things that I talk about is the dreaded question, "What do you do?" Which I hate. I call it the networking equivalent of "Do you come here often?" Because it leads to the type of preconceptions that we're talking about today. Have you been tempted to introduce yourself to people as a children's author rather than as a director of investments or owner or founder of an investments consultancy?
Yeah, well, I actually have uh, three bios, which is all the same
Mm.
information, but they're just told in a different order. So I have Rob Gardner, the financial activist. I've written a children's book. I founded a children's charity. I chair the Children's Financial Education Council, and I'm also director of St James's Place. Or I'm director of St James's Place. I also founded a company called Redington and Mallow Street, and I also founded a charity called Red Start, and I wrote a children's book called Save Your Acorns. So the the way the order in which I tell it changes depending on who I'm speaking to, and how. So that's the advantage of having a few strings on your bow. You
Yeah.
can you can describe it in a different way, and it has a different meaning to different audiences.
Do you notice a difference in the way people respond to them, and does that tell you much about their personality?
Yeah, look, I mean, the reality is I've always worked in either finance or pensions or now wealth management, and I think in normal it's a bit of a bore, right? So uh, if you lead with that, people start with an assumption about who you are. So
Yeah.
it's always, whereas if you say, "Oh, I wrote a children's book," as you say, it's different, and instantly it prompts a follow-up question. Or if you talk about, uh, you know, I, I'd set up a financial education charity and I want to teach young people how to earn it, keep it, grow it. It leads to a very different conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, it sums up what I've been trying to teach all of these years in one great example. Before we move on, Steve Lowell has said hello from Canada. Steve is the new president of the Global Speakers Federation. So welcome, Stephen, and great to see you here. And Stephen Mitchell has said, hi, Andy, please, you've got Rob on. He's a very interesting man. And I think anyone listening to this at the moment would agree. So if you are joining the live stream and you're on LinkedIn as Andrew Stephen R, or Facebook or YouTube, feel free to drop a note in the comments. I will come to them, not all immediately, because obviously I want to keep the flow of the conversation going, but do add your thoughts and observations as we go through. So let's go back to that scenario, Rob, where people are responding differently to you based on whether or not they engage with your job title or your interests, your passions. I think it's fair to call them that. Do you find that, and I might be putting you on the spot to think about something that happens subconsciously rather than consciously, but do you find that you warm more to people who really show that interest and respond to those passions than you do when they just keep things very transactional and very focused on job title and role?
Yeah, look, 100%. I mean, I have the challenge of too many emails, too many LinkedIn messages, too many WhatsApp messages, too many text messages. So how do you filter from that? And I definitely never filter by seniority, and I want to make sure that I meet the new graduates, the new summer interns, the new apprenticeships. Which LinkedIn message do you respond to? And I'll give you an example. Of a few weeks ago, I did it was a small video on choices versus pensions for kids, and it's called the City Parents Network. So it's basically parents who work in the city, work for banks, fund managers, insurance. And again, I just got this lovely message from someone on LinkedIn. I didn't know them, so they sent a connection request. But in it, they said, hey, Rob, I just wanted to reach out. I watched your video. It was really helpful. It's something that me and my husband have never considered. In fact, it prompted a really interesting conversation between us about what we want to do. But I just wanted to say thank you very much. And it would be great to sort of, catch up and have a coffee. My propensity to reply to that is so much higher than, at the other end, there's someone trying to sell me software services from Ukraine, or sell me their private equity fund from America with no link whatsoever. So yeah, absolutely. I think my propensity to respond is linked to the amount of effort they put in to it, and it's back to my point about being curious. I think it's not hard to know much about me. Like literally a 2-minute Google search, a 2-minute search on Twitter, Google gives you enough of an in to have a, hey Rob, I saw you talk about this, or I'd love to talk to you about that. But I would say less than 10% of people who reach out to me do that, and it always amazes me.
Yeah, I was mentoring a client last week, and we were focused on his LinkedIn usage, and he's in a very competitive sales role, very competitive industry, probably one of the most competitive in the world. And the people they sell to have every defense up against the people selling to them. And his message that he was sending out before our call was quite simply, this is who I am, this is my role, I'd love to find out what I can do for you. And I said, you're not going to get a response from that. I mean, he was getting people accept, but no conversation. And I said, read their profile. And if they're not completing their profile, because they're in an industry where they don't tend to write as much on their profile as you or I might, Google them. Look for public meetings they've been involved with. And as you say, it doesn't take a long time. I think even the hardest to track down, you're not going to spend more than 5 or 10 minutes doing a search, and you're either going to find something useful or you're going to find out there's not anything in the public domain. So that little bit of extra effort, I think, is easily reflected in the response that you get. Okay, so let's take a step back, because I've talked about your passions, and I think that's actually really quite interesting. You've shared a bit of your journey and how your experience living in Argentina as a child informed, what you wanted to do and where that passion came from. Generally, did you Did you always know that you wanted to do something that would have a positive impact on the world? Whether you knew that was going to be financial education, or whether you knew that was going to be about the environment, but you knew you had a mission of some kind, and were you always looking for it? Or did you just sort of focus on what the right career path was, and then find, actually, now I'm in a position I want to make an impact?
Yeah, more the latter, but I think it's almost in two stages. So, I mean, when I was at school, all I wanted to be was a fighter pilot like Maverick in Top Gun, and there was this poster in my school that said most people have their initials on a briefcase. I've got my name on the side of a plane, and it was this picture of a person, flight lieutenant, whoever, flight lieutenant Lapata, and it was on the side of this RAF Tornado. And as a 16-year-old boy, I was like, it doesn't get any better. So that's kind of what I wanted to do. And in fact, if I can just take a diversion, that was where my life lesson about what we're talking about came across, because I actually applied for a flying scholarship. I joined what was called the Air Training Corps, and I went to apply, and I went for like it was like a 2-day interview camp situation. At the end of it, I didn't get it, and the great thing about the RAF is they gave you a debriefing interview, and I was gutted that I didn't get it. But they explained to me, they said, look, Rob, when we asked you why do you want to join the RAF, you gave a really good level 1 answer. But those kids over there that got a flying scholarship, they gave a level 2 and a level 3. So when we said, can you name some RAF bases around the world? You just named countries. They knew the names of the actual RAF bases. When we asked you, what do you want to fly? You said a Tornado, and you knew the difference between a GR5 and a GR3. But when we asked you what missile system they have, you didn't know. They knew the answer to that. When we asked you this, you knew that. When we asked them that, you knew that. And our advice to you is, if you really want a job, you need to demonstrate that you have done your homework and that you really want to. That advice was given to me at 16. I suppose that's the standard now I hold everyone to when people come to talk to me or get a meeting in my diary, which is prepare. And that was the message. And the good thing about that is that when I was at university applying for summer internship roles and graduate positions, I didn't do the scattergun apply to many. I really zoned in on just 2 or 3 companies and really did my homework and got really clear. And I vowed to myself I would never make that mistake again of going to an interview and not being able to articulate why I want to be a pilot, why I want to join the RAF, why I want to fly a particular plane. So why do I want to be an investment consultant? Why do I want to work for Redington? Why do I want to work in wealth management? Why do I want to work in SJP? I think if you can't answer these questions, there will be someone else out there who can do it better and should therefore deserve the role more than you. So I'd say over the beginning of my career, I was very much still kind of stuck in the kind of mindset of, you study A levels, you go to university and you get a good job, and no one really tells you what a good job is, and you just have this sort of trajectory. I started working in investment banking, and I suppose we'll probably touch on this later. I met some really interesting people, including Dawid Kanotia-Hulu, who I later went on to start a business with. And it was probably when I met Dawid and started thinking that actually a career in finance isn't what I wanted, or a career in investment banking isn't what I want to keep doing. I want to find a way to solve an issue that I'm now an expert in, and that was sort of around pensions. That I did really get this idea of purpose and impact. So that was probably 2005 and 2006. And then I suppose that went to the next level in 2012 when I did the Key Person of Influence program with Dan Priestley, and I met a guy called Mike Harris. Mike Harris founded First Direct. He founded Egg, and he's got this whole idea of purpose beyond money. And that's when I really started doing some work and connecting with my passion for transforming people's financial future. And what if everything that I do in my career and in my platform helps people feel confident about their financial future? And then I've carried on working on that. And today that same sentiment is financial well-being in a world worth living in. So everything that I do is connected around those two things. But I would say pre 2006, I was just following a standard uh, career trajectory, and then from 2006 onwards, I started getting this idea about much more sort of purpose and impact led, and that's just grown over time.
And I'm thinking back. I mean, I can't remember when the Mallow Street event was when we first got.
2007, I
Was
think.
it 2007? I knew it was before you talked about the KPI, because I knew you going on the. I think in fact I saw you at the KPI program when I came to observe it one day in central London. I saw you in the room, but so I know that your star was already flying quite high before you went on that KPI program. Have you felt that since you discovered that purpose, that your impact, your trajectory has accelerated, and the way that people have engaged with you has changed?
I suppose there's no counterfactual. I suppose what I do know is that my energy, no one needs to motivate me to do stuff that's connected with my purpose. So your inner flywheel, your inner drive is a lot higher. So I think that's important, right? I mean, there's some stuff that, doing my tax return is just something requires a lot of effort, and it's not something I run to do. Whereas if someone says, can you come and could you do something for City UK and teach parents about pensions versus choices? I will find a way to carve time in my diary to do that. So I think that's important. I think the second thing is when you connect with it, there's a kind of level of authenticity. And I think thirdly, there's a clarity about where you spend your time. So I've been involved with lots of stuff. I think, I abseiled off the Shards about 10 years ago and raised money for charity for the Royal Marines. I used to be involved with Cancer Research UK and their Catalyst Club. And look, both wonderful charities, both wonderful causes, but they're not my causes. They're not my purpose. And in a world where we all have 168 hours, you have 168 hours, I have 168 hours, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk only have 168 hours a week, right? So we all have the same time. What I think purpose gives you is real clarity about where you invest that time.
It's interesting because the title of our show is about judging a book by the cover, and the focus of that premise is external. How do other people judge you, and what impact does that have on your relationship? But like many people say that, being able to be loved starts with loving yourself. I guess your ability to connect with people starts with connecting with yourself, and judging your own book by your own cover. I think it's very simple to get onto that career path and say, right, I'm an investment manager, and this is what an investment manager is. Therefore, that's who I must be. And as you say, once you find your purpose, then that changes your own relationship with the work that you're doing and the impact you make.
Can I give you a brilliant example of that? And I know, so you're into your football. I'm not into football. Never have. Of course, I watched the Euros and was a fan for a few weeks, but I'm just not into football. So I was at Deutsche Bank, and I'd moved internally from a structuring desk where I was covering Spanish clients to a sales desk covering UK clients, and I was covering UK banks and building societies. So think Bradford and Bingley, Northern Rock, Nationwide. This is like a long time ago now. This is like 20 years ago. And the salesperson handed me a load of his accounts, and I logged onto this system called Bloomberg, and he built this spreadsheet that had all the football clubs of all the people he was covering. And then basically he'd say, what you do is you call up Andy and you look up what football club and you see how they're doing, and then you pretend to be interested. And I was like, no, that doesn't. I remember I was like 22, 23 years old, and I decided there and then that will never be me. That will never be how I do sales. I made a very conscious decision that people would want to do business with me because of how well I understood their business, how much effort I put, and all the rest, not because we bantered about football or something. I'm not interested in. And I think, and then linked to that is to be really clear about what you like. And so I like tennis. I love tennis. And it's not to say I don't like football, but I'm not going to pretend to be passionate about it. I'm not going to effectively lie to. That's disingenuous, right? And I think being really comfortable and being in your skin about what you like and don't like, and being able to share that, I think is so important. But I think that's a great example of bad advice I was given early in my career.
I completely agree with you. In Death Came Third, my second book, I've got a section that says it's okay to talk about football if you like football. And I think that anything that you do has to be authentic if you're going to truly connect on a long-term basis, which is how you build a relationship. And if you lie to get into the relationship, you're going to get found out through the course of the relationship. So that authenticity at the beginning is absolutely key. You can show an interest to a degree, but I know plenty of people that hate football and find trying to feign an interest in office conversations painful. So don't try. You can be polite at times, but then you move the conversation on at the appropriate time.
So I mean, there's a colleague at work, and he's a massive Liverpool Football Club fan. I'm interested in why he's a Liverpool fan.
Mm.
So I'm always interested in why you a fan in that. What. So I've got a personal trainer at work, and he's a Man U fan, and I was intrigued to know why he was. So I always ask people, why are you a Man United
Yeah.
fan? And I think the answer to that question is always interesting and insightful.
Yeah. I'm assuming they're both from Surrey. We've got Susie Parkes has joined us on Facebook and is typing lots of comments. So she said that, with titles, we often make assumptions or have ideas about who someone is, what they do, their roles. And I think what's key here, any potential synergy. So we just assume that our passion and purpose lights us up and we somehow find a reserve of energy we never knew we had, which is when we were talking about knowing yourself and knowing what drives you as well. You can't know others to a level at which you've not met with yourself first, which I like, Susie said. And the worst thing to do is have a false interest in something or make out like you know someone. They do when you don't, as it all comes out in the wash, which is my point about the long-term relationships. So hi Susie, and thanks for contributing that. Rob, I'm going to turn the spotlight on you now. In terms of the theme of the conversation, which is judging books by their cover, and I've asked you a lot about how people judge you, but what about how you judge other people? Can you recall when you've been guilty, maybe, of creating a first impression of someone and assumed that they were, based on the way they dressed, the way they spoke, their age, whatever it might be, assumed one thing about them, but over time you've discovered that there's a lot more to them than met the eye originally?
Yeah, look, I mean, of course, I mean, we all have biases and judges. I mean, that's almost part of nature, right? It's a deliberate design feature to do that. Uh, I'm I'm trying to think. I certainly don't judge people by their clothes and what they wear, and I suppose I'm always a bit suspicious of people, especially in a work environment. I think for a lot of men, they use the suit as a bit of a corporate, uh, like body armor, not body
Armor.
armor, but and it's interesting then when you see those same people in a different context, and sometimes they feel very different, not as confident, not as when they're in their suit. At the same time, there are people who love to dress well, and I you know Italians just spring to mind anyway, right? They just some people just love to dress well. I think, how do you do that? That's a real skill and art. I think specifically when people meet me, I do judge people by the amount of effort that they have put in. So they haven't, back to my kind of REF example, if they've not put much effort into the meeting, I'll let them know. I often, as I say, meet graduates and interns, and I always try and make time for them, and I always look them up on LinkedIn. I read their bios and all the rest. And the number of times I've done more preparation for a meeting with graduates and summer interns than they have on me. And so I suppose I'm guilty of holding them to the same standard that I would hold them. But I try and sort of make the point and say, look, if you're lucky enough to have got a meeting with someone in an organization that is time poor and all the rest, put in the effort, think about what question you want to ask, think about it in advance. I suppose the amazing thing about the last 15, 18 months, and then when you meet some people that you've not met, is how just physically how different people are. Some people are much taller than you thought, and some people are much shorter than you thought. And you go and meet people and go, "Oh, hey Rob, how are you?" And I'm like, "Who are you?" And just because mentally you've assumed they're just a different height than the person that you've been speaking to on a screen for the last uh, however long. And I suppose the other thing is, and I do try hard to do that, it is to try and understand what is their purpose, what do they like outside of work, because I think a lot of people wear their professional mask, and it's easy to sort of make an assumption about that. And then I I suppose I do work in an industry with a lot of actuaries and accountants, and we have different sort of personality profiles, and introverts and extroverts, and certain personality characteristics just make it harder to get to know people. I think some people are easier to read than others is the truth, and then I suppose I can be guilty of making an assumption that that person was a bit aloof, and actually no, they were just a bit shy or a bit uncomfortable in that situation. That's probably the one I'm most guilty of.
There's a few things I want to pick up on there. First of all, for anyone who's become a regular listener to the podcast, I am shorter than you imagine me to be. And in fact, for people who've met me in person, I'm still shorter than you remember. Just on the last point first, because I think that's a really important one, the personality style. Not everyone, you might have the best intentions of wanting to find out about people, getting to know the real them, being curious, as you said at the very beginning, Rob, but they might not be welcome. They might not be open to that. For them, it's an invasion of their privacy. So we have to read the other person and read the mood in the room. And sometimes you just won't build a rapport, even if it's a client you've worked with for years. It remains transactional because they're not willing to open their life. And as Brits, we're that's very, very common, because Brits tend to separate professional and personal lives much more than, say, Italians. You mentioned Italians. I remember talking at a conference in Milan and explaining how we don't like to do business with family, typically in the UK, and they were all aghast. And someone said, "But the family is the business." So you have to recognise that cultural sensibility. When you talk about how people dress, and I've got a question for you on this in a second, but it brings back, excuse me, it brings back a memory from years ago when I was dealing with an area manager for a high street bank, and we were working together quite a lot, and she always impressed me. And a lot of what I didn't realise at the time, but a lot of what impressed me was how she presented herself. She was a power dresser, but not overtly, not Dragon's Den dragon power dresser, but a natural power dresser, very smartly presented every time I met her. I then bumped into her in the supermarket on a weekend morning, and she hadn't showered yet that morning, hadn't put makeup on, was wearing tracksuit, and it was the complete opposite. It was such a discordant note for me. And I'm not saying that she should have made herself up and worn a suit to go to the supermarket. Absolutely not. But it does bring home just how much we invest in appearances, because I know that I didn't see her in the same light again. Wrongly. I'm not saying I was right to do so, but I know naturally I just didn't see her in the same light again. So that leads to the question, and it's been, I don't think I've asked this on the podcast, but it's been in the sort of forefront of my mind for a while. A lot of people, myself included, have had meetings on Zoom and Teams and so forth over the last year and a half in our homes without the green screens. Those were dropped a while ago, wearing T-shirts. We're both wearing polo shirts today, wearing our casual clothes. And in fact, I remember going to a client meeting or joining a client meeting on Zoom, and everyone laughed because I was in a suit and they were all in T-shirts and rugby shirts and so forth. And now I will wear a shirt to present. And I have, yes, presented in shirt and shorts, particularly when it was in the heat wave. What do you think we'll go back to when we go back to meeting in person, particularly in your industry, which is the pinstripe suit world?
Well, I think that bit has gone. I think that people will revert back to the sort of smart casual, but it'll be a lot more. It'll just be a lot more fluid because now we will never go back to the everyone in the office until 9 till 6. I've been probably going back in more than most, and then you end up in the weird situation where you're in the office having a Teams or Zoom meeting with someone who's at home, and so it's all going to be in a group. I think just as a side digression, I think the one advantage of wearing a suit to work every day is it meant that I was monitoring my waistline more than I have been
Yes,
in lockdown.
definitely.
So it forces you to think about that. Look, I don't know. I think clothing, it means different things with different people. For me, it's always been important to wear what I feel comfortable in. And the joke at SJP is, I think I've worn a tie about 3 times in the last 2.5 years. And even before of this, for me, wearing a tie wasn't something. But I like to ideally be dressed smart, and of course people do judge you by that. I was going to say one thing is that when I was a bit younger and when I was at Redington, so this is probably going back 10 years and up to 5 years, I used to always wear glasses. So I used to wear glasses during the week, and then the weekend I wouldn't wear glasses, and so sometimes people bump into me and not recognize me. And I used to wear glasses deliberately because it makes me look older. I now deliberately don't wear glasses because it makes me look older and I want to look younger. But I think you can change your look or appearance, and therefore your kind of gravitas or how you want to come across or how open you are by what you wear. So it's definitely worth thinking about.
I mean, my gut feeling is that, for example, in your industry, financial advisors will not, most of them, the vast majority, will go back to wearing suits when they meet clients. I think it's so ingrained in the industry. There will be those who actually are more comfortable and build a better rapport in a smart leisure wear, effectively. And I wouldn't imagine going into a corporate client's office wearing my jeans and a polo shirt. We'll see where it goes.
So actually, I think the trick is you need to mirror your audience. So again, when I worked at Redington, I used to have a client. One was basically a Big Four auditor, very traditional suit and tie, and then another was a TV company where the CEO and everyone else was wearing jeans, and everyone was like super snappily dressed. Don't get me wrong; it was like people looked good, but no one was wearing suits. And if you went from the Big Four auditor with your suit and tie and you walked into their offices, you look like a fish out of water. Yeah. So, look, I must admit, at work, I always wear a suit without a tie. If I need to put a tie on, I do. If you want it a bit more casual, you can drop the jacket. You're in a nice halfway house in between. And I think that's the point, right? It's probably, if you're in a business that you're serving your clients, it's back to that sort of empathetic point. Mirror your clients, and then that shows you're paying a bit more attention. So what you don't want to turn up to is a entrepreneurial startup full of a load of sort of 30-year-olds who are all in t-shirts and much more relaxed look. And if you turn up in a suit and a tie, you're not gonna be appealing to work with for them.
Yeah. It's always been one that I've battled with, to be honest, because I recognise the argument, but I've always felt that I want people, if they saw me in one environment, it would be consistent with how they saw me in another environment. But I walked into a school recently to deliver a presentation to year 10 school kids, and they were doing a whole development day, and I was the only person wearing a suit, and it did jar. It really did. So I wouldn't quite go to the shorts and polo shirts that some were wearing, but it really did feel I did feel out of place there. We're coming to the end of our conversation for the Monday podcast, and there's something you've touched on a few times during the conversation that I just want to look at a little bit more. I think it's an important message to reinforce on this topic, and you've talked about the number of people that want to sell to you. You've talked about being time poor. does the way that people engage with you, and you've answered this to a degree, so in what ways does the way people engage with you when they first meet you, if they want to sell to you, how does it impact your response? How can someone, let's phrase that better, how can someone approach you with a view ultimately to selling to you, but really get you to engage and listen?
So for me, back to that kind of RAF interview is in your interaction, whether it's an email, a cold email, or a cold LinkedIn message, demonstrate that you've done a bit of work to make me go, why should I answer to your message or email rather than someone else's? Then make sure that it's sincere, because if I follow up and then it's insincere, then I will find out very quickly.
Yeah.
And to be honest, if you get those two things, you're probably through. But again, I'm highly confident that even saying this now, only 10% of people will do that.
Yeah, if you're lucky. Rob, thank you so much. You're going to hang around. We're going to have a chat for our Thursday podcast on the impact of professional relationships on your career to date. But in the meantime, I think that's been really interesting, some great insights, and thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for listening.
And thanks to everyone who contributed comments and questions, Susie and Andrew and Stephen and Steve. Susie said, great interview, guys. Don't run away, Susie, because we're going on to the next one now. Do you need a moment to stretch, Rob, or are you happy to crack on? We'll crack on with the second one. So if you are not a regular listener to the podcast and you missed me talk about it at the beginning, on the Monday, the interview that we've just conducted comes out. I think that's coming out in about 3 weeks' time. And then on the Thursday, we do a shorter podcast focused specifically on the premise of the podcast, which is the impact of professional relationships on executive success. Stephen, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you very much. Stephen Mitchell said it was excellent. So we're now going to go into that. There's 3 set questions. I may well pick up on something Rob says and explore a little more deeply, but we'll be aiming for about 15 to 20 minutes. So Rob knows the questions to this already. So Rob, we're going to kick off, as is normal, with looking at the impact that professional relationships have had on your career so far.
Okay, crack on.
Crack on. So, can you tell us about the impact that professional relationships have had on your career so far, and where have they made the strongest impact for you?
Well, look, I think in terms of sort of let me categorize them by impact. The person who by a long way is Dawid Kanoti-Ahulu. So I first met Dawid in 2003, and he was trying to hire me to come and work for him at Merrill Lynch. So he was looking for someone to join his team, and uh, and yeah. So look, that was the beginning of a relationship. We've known each other for a long time. In 2006, we both left Merrill Lynch and founded Redington, and we said we wanted to do to pensions what Jamie Oliver did to school food. We then, a few years later, founded Mallow Street. Dawid was the best man at my wedding. We've built 2 businesses together. We are best friends. We've had the biggest arguments. We've been through every up and down. If there was the equivalent of a sort of professional marriage, that would be Dawid and I. We've been through thick and thin together, and I am blessed to have him as a friend. But it started as as a boss and someone coming to work for him. So he's probably been my biggest professional relationship. But then along the way, there have been a number of key people. So actually, one is Lutfi Siddiqui, and I just did a podcast for him on the CFA. He was probably one of my first bosses at Deutsche Bank, and he taught me how to price FX, foreign exchange options and derivatives, and then he's gone off. He now lives in Singapore. I obviously now work for St. James's Place, but he's taken on a new role at the CFA, and he was doing a podcast called Pay It Forward, and he reached out to me, and I mean we've still been in touch all these years later, and wanted me on his show, and I think that's powerful, right? That we've known someone for that long, and those relationships are there, and I always remember he would taking the time to teach me about pricing options and and structuring and how to present. Uh, Another one which is standout for me is when I started Redington, I suppose the most important relationship, apart from the person you start the business with, is your first client. And our first client was the Royal Mail, but specifically it was Frank Chanella at the Royal Mail, and he was the finance director of letters at the time, and he was looking for someone to advise him on the Royal Mail deficit. And I think he took a massive risk, appointing Dowd and Rob of Redington Partners to advise Royal Mail and a massive company with a massive pension deficit. So, he our relationship has been, that was transformational, and one I'm always incredibly grateful for. And I suppose more recently is my predecessor at SJP. So David Lamb. David Lamb is someone I knew as a client, and we probably had a meeting in late 2017 where he shared with me that he was planning on retiring, and that there would be a process to look for his replacement, and would I be interested in sort of interviewing and taking part in the process, to which I said yes, and here I am. So they're just a handful of professional relationships. It would be remiss not to say probably the most important, which is I met my wife at work. So I wouldn't be married with two kids if I'd not met my wonderful wife, and that started as a professional relationship.
You'd be in trouble if you didn't mention that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would.
I mean, obviously when I'd started working with you guys, I got to know both you and David, and you really did start to see the two of you coming as a pair. It was quite a shock when you both went off to do your own things in a sense. It's interesting, and Stephen's just posted a question that I'll come to in a second on this point. It's been interesting for me asking this question, that probably over the last few months it's changed, interestingly, over the nearly a year that I've been recording the podcast, but most of the answers in this question over recent months, and I've commented on this before, most of the answers have been bosses. And the impact of the bosses have made on someone's career, and I could probably write a book on that. I'm not going to. I've got enough to do, and another book in the pipeline. But there's been so many comments about bosses, not many about clients, and it was really good to hear you talk about that, because from my own perspective, I look at my relationships with clients, and a lot of those, particularly the very rewarding ones, do go on for a long time. So I've got a couple of follow-up questions, as I mentioned I might do on that. We'll keep them relatively short, but Stephen Mitchell's asked on LinkedIn, don't you think you can learn from bad bosses as much or as well as the good ones?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that's when Dowd and I founded Redington. I think there are many good things about investment banking, the kind of proactivity, the very driven nature. But there were some very dysfunctional sort of bosses at in investment banks, and you definitely don't want to do that. It's no different from parenting, right? You know the stuff that you do want to carry over as a parent, and you know the stuff that you don't want to carry over. So I think that's always important. What do I want to learn from that boss? And I do the same with clients. Actually, I was privileged to work with lots of chairs of trustees. And it would amaze me the difference between the really good chairs and the really bad chairs, and there was the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you learn as much from the bad and the ugly as you do from the good, for sure.
A few weeks ago on the podcast, I shared what's become my Goldilocks story, which was my first three bosses in my first permanent proper job, and the first one was far too cold. And I just didn't want to work for him because he was such a miserable sod all of the time. The second was far too warm. He was lovely and fluffy and friendly, but we never took him seriously and didn't respect him. And the third was just right. He could be a mate, he could be conversational and social and engaging, but if you stepped out of line, he could clamp down on you, and we respected him for that. So I think that's quite a nice way. You talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I had the three bears, and it really at a young age, when my next role was my first management role. I'm not saying I did it particularly well, but what I was able to do was to try not to veer too far to either extreme of being too cold or too hot. The other thing that came out of your first answer, that I picked up, and Susie, who's watching on Facebook, picked up. Susie said relationships that stand the test of time are a testimony to the foundations on which they were initially built. And she refers to the fact that she and I have known each other for over a decade, and we're still connected as you and I are, Rob. What do you think needs to go into relationships to ensure that in a decade or 2 decades time, those people are there for you if you need them?
Well, I think your framework, your kind of 7 steps to relationship
Mm.
are probably perfect, right? But there's a point at which trust has to come in, and so otherwise you're just someone at work that you might have a beer with, or a client that you kind of get on with because you're a client. But there's a point in time where you like them, you enjoy spending time with them, you trust them, and I suppose probably something good or bad has to happen. It's probably usually bad, where that person helps you out or does something and they leave you feeling that they have your back, and that is what counts. I've known Dawid 18 years now, and I know he's got my back, and he knows I've got his back, no matter what. You know, if he was in trouble anywhere in the world and he called me up, I'd drop everything
Yeah.
to be there, and I know he'd do the same for me. And I think that's accumulated from having gone through a lots of highs and lows together. So you can't short circuit that level of relationship. And it's the same with marriage, right? The easy bit is to get engaged and get married. The hard bit is to stay married once you're married. That requires real effort, real persistence. It requires working on your relationship. Relationships require nurturing, and the nature of your relationship evolves over time. I mean, you've got to remember that Dawid met me when he was 39. I don't think I was like 24. So the nature of our relationship then, and he was hiring me as an MD in an investment bank to join as a sort of junior on his desk, to we've co-founded 2 businesses, we've gone through that, and our relationship today, it's very different. And if sometimes those relationships don't evolve and they don't adapt.
And you talked about when people have your back. I think that's such a great image for this, because you want to be in that stage where if you don't talk to someone for 5 years, 8 years, you can pick up the phone and it feels like yesterday. I spoke to my best friend at sixth form the other day, a couple of evenings ago, and we've stayed in touch through social media, but he doesn't use it very actively. And it's just nice to be able to pick up the phone to someone like that and say, let's go out, let's catch up properly. And I think that can happen, and trust me, at my age that's a long time ago, but you can still do that. So I think that, yeah, getting to that point and knowing they have your back even if you haven't spoken for a while would be key. You touched on the fact that you and Dawood have argued over the years and had raging arguments, and I've seen. I don't think you said raging arguments. I've put my own interpretation on that, but I've seen that happen in business over the years. Of course, in my own business with my dad, and elsewhere. What's your own experience of where relationships have gone wrong, particularly, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, look, I've had several relationships go wrong over the years, and I think it normally stems from a lack of understanding. And there's a relationship where I had with someone at work, and to begin with, it was pretty good. We got on really well at work, we got on well outside of work, but over time, this was a person who, being on time and timeliness was extremely important to them. Uh, what was important to me was looking after clients and being there, and often those would clash. And therefore, I might be stuck in Canary Wharf in a client meeting, and then come back from a meeting with you. Let's say it was you, Andy, and I'd be late, and that that to him was a big thing. But it never really sort of, uh, neither side, I suppose, really took the time to understand, why was I? It wasn't a malicious intent, or all the rest. And I suppose over time, just naturally drifted apart because we didn't try and talk and understand what wasn't firing. And I suppose that was because the strength of the relationship wasn't that strong beforehand. It started to go south. Now, with hindsight, I understand very clearly why it went south. Didn't at the moment because I think you jump to conclusions and we never put in the effort to repair it. If I contrast that with my relationship with Dowd, and I remember it was about 2013 was probably the low point. And you've got two ways. You either kind of fight or people can just sort of go in the opposite direction. And so if you could have probably tracked mine and Dowd's relationship by the number of phone calls, the number of times we do. If you'd sort of tracked it, you'd have just seen it slowly
Yeah.
going off. So we just were probably drifting apart. So it didn't look like on the surface anything was wrong. And I remember once that I was invited to a lunch, and it was with someone, and I hadn't invited him, or someone invited me, and then he got annoyed that I'd been invited. He misunderstood how I'd got invited, and anyway, it was all a bit of a disaster, and it was going really badly. But then luckily we had a sort of coach who was helping us and our team, and he's called Andrea Faccini, and he talked to us about sort of transaction analysis. He talked to us about parent-child and adult-adult, and this sort of idea that conversations need to be like a dance and move forwards and backwards. And he effectively brokered a conversation back with us where we both engaged and understood why we were missing each other. And I have to say, since then, it's only got better and better. But I think there are two things to that point: is relationships come off the boil. That's natural. It's easy to jump to conclusions, the first part of this podcast, but you can get them on track, but you need to want to invest the time and effort to get that relationship back on track.
I think this point about communication comes up time and again, unsurprisingly, and this scenario where you're just not talking to each other and you're making assumptions. Our Monday podcast was all about making assumptions, and that's where relationships really do go south. And your last point, you've got to want to talk to each other, and it doesn't necessarily follow that every relationship is one that you want to rebuild, and that's okay as well, as long as you're clear in your mind as to why and that that's the right thing.
Can I link that back to professional relationships? So I've been involved a few times, either where I've been at Redington and maybe we've done something wrong and it's messed up with the client, or I've been in a few situations now where I've been at SJP and a major supplier, a major relationship has something's gone wrong. And I think that what I've now learned is stuff goes wrong. It's how you respond. It's your ability to step into that with openness and trust, even quite often where maybe you don't have that strong a professional relationship. So I can think of two situations at work where I've had to deal with the supplier, and actually because we've both embraced the problem together, we've accepted that these things happen and then focused on our response. And actually through that, in the space of a very short period of time, have built a very strong relationship, because it's through adversity and being open and trusting that you can build real strength. And there's a recognition that unless it's purely down to sort of incompetence or malpractice, that stuff can go wrong. It's therefore how do you respond and how do you deal with that? How do you face into that is so important. So it's probably a bit of a digression on building professional relationships, but I do think there's something on how you respond when things go wrong.
Not at all. It's a core philosophy of mine. And in fact, in my talk on building professional relationships, I share a story of how the biggest disaster I've ever had in terms of a program I've delivered, my lead client on that has become a subsequent client, one of my biggest referrers, and my mentor. So it is all about opening up and having the conversation. That just came from a lunch where he said, "Why don't we use you anymore?" I said, "Don't you remember what happened?" He said, "Yes, but why?" And we got into it, and that just, the relationship was strong, which was key, but that allowed us to turn things around. Final question, because I'm aware of our time and your time. What are the top resources you'd recommend that have made a big impact on you, either over the course of your career or recently? Books, podcasts, talks, whatever you feel you'd like to share.
Look, I think my go-to recommendation is always How Will I Measure My Life by Clay Christensen. I think that really forced me to think not just about my professional life, but my personal life, and especially as I've gone on to be a father and a parent, this idea that, time is limited. In fact, your most precious resource is your time, and how you spend your time, who you spend your time with, what you spend your time on is crucial. So that book has been a North Star in helping me think about those questions. A book I love is Beyond Entrepreneurship, or B 2.0 by Jim Collins. But to be honest, any of Jim Collins's books are excellent. Good to Great, Great by Choice, Built to Last. And that book is, if you've not read any of them, read that book, because it basically summarizes all of his books from the last 20 years. I love this Farnham Street blog. You can sign up to it. It's a weekly email. You get like brilliant book recommendations and podcasts. And then one of the things that I've really got into is the Calm app. They've got meditations, they've got stories. I love their series by Ryan Holiday on Stoic philosophy. I found that really helpful, especially over the last 18 months. So they would be my ones that spring to mind.
Fantastic. I've used Calm before, but I didn't know the extent of the app, so I'll have to revisit that. And Built to Last and Good to Great come up fairly frequently on the show, but not Beyond Entrepreneurship, I think you said. So
yeah, it only came out about 3-4 months ago. So
right,
it's his
okay.
book.
Excellent. So we're bang on topic. Rob, thank you so much over both episodes. As I expected, you've provided great value and excellent insights. So I really appreciate you joining me, and it's been worth the wait.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be on. Take care.
So thank you very much to Rob, and thank you to all of you for joining me. It's been great on a Friday afternoon, which tend to be the quieter ones of the live streams, to have so much engagement and interaction. If you're watching this on the replay, then please feel free to comment anyway. Rob's tagged on LinkedIn, and I'll send him the YouTube link. I think we're Facebook friends as well, so I'll make sure he's tagged there if we are, so that he can pick up any comments or questions that you have, and of course I'll monitor that as well. Over August we do have some more live streams coming. I can't give you dates at the moment. I think 2 weeks today we've got a really good one penciled in, but that's not confirmed yet, so I can't share the details. Next week's quiet because my neighbour is having a new kitchen installed, so I think the building work, she saw my new kitchen and immediately booked the builder for hers, and I've had to sort of watch all the podcast recordings. But there are a couple that haven't been live streamed that are excellent, that are coming up in the next 2 weeks on the podcast. So make sure you go to podfollow.com/connected leadership. I don't know why I'm saying that slowly, because it's been on screen under my name for the last hour and a quarter. So go and check that out. We're on about episode 90. So if you're new to the podcast, you've got Olympians, you've got astronauts, you've got symphonic conductors, you've got senior military leaders and government leaders in the US on there. There's plenty to catch up on. And if not, I'll join you again soon, either here or on the podcast. But on the Connected Leadership podcast. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you soon.